Are you ready for a history lesson?
When am I not ready for a history lesson?
We haven't talked about a historical figure in many episodes.
No, it's been a while.
So today I want to talk about Michael Dillon, and I specifically chose Michael Dillon because of our guest today. We have not really explored a lot of trans people in our historical endeavors, and so I think this is like a really good trans person to talk about.
We have talked about trans people, just not like trans men in
That's
history
true.
necessarily.
Thank you.
I always think of the universal friend, the public universal friend, who was a trans person.
We certainly have, but I think we've leaned. Well, anyway, that's besides the point.
Yes. Anyway, sorry.
Michael Dillon was born in 1915 in Folkestone, Kent, England, and was raised by a wealthy British family. And I'm going to use that word baronetcy again, as we did with another historical figure in the past. But Dillon, from an early age, saw the disconnect between his gender identity and the sex assigned at birth, ended up going to St. Anne's College, studying at Oxford, studied classics, and then went on to study medicine later on in life, which is going to become really important for the story as we move on.
Listen, I love people who study medicine. I studied medicine. It's
exactly.
Great.
In the 1940s, Dillon began living as a man, adopting the name Michael. He started using hormone therapy with testosterone, which was incredibly groundbreaking at the time. This is the 1940s. There were not a lot of people who were truly, that we know of, using testosterone or any kind of hormone therapy. He also received a double mastectomy, which he could be considered, again, to the knowledge that we have, the first trans man to receive a double mastectomy. And get this, was granted a doctor's note by that doctor that allowed him to change his birth certificate in the 1940s.
Wow. 1940s, and you're able to change your birth certificate. That's wild.
And in England, where they're actively fighting against people being able to change their birth certificate now, let alone at the time that this is happening. So, yeah. Besides the point.
Yeah, we could get into my opinions on the English government.
Let us know on social media how you feel about the English government and trans people right now. But
also, we are two Americans, so
yes.
Please keep that in mind as well.
Which is why we need to be educated more. In 1945, he met Sir Harold Gillies. Do you know of Gillies' work at all?
I have heard the last name for certain. Put a gun to my head, I could probably come up with something, but right now in this moment, I'm struggling.
As I describe his work, you may remember this. Gillies had already made a name for himself because he was really the inventor of facial reconstruction surgery for World War I veterans who'd been torn apart by shrapnel.
Yes.
He also was reconstructing penises of World War I veterans, which gave him a huge amount of knowledge when he met Michael Dillon and they had the conversation about gender affirming surgery. And so between 1946 and 1949, again, Michael Dillon is considered the very first trans man to receive gender affirming surgery. And this presented
gender
a
affirming
huge
bottom surgery.
Thank you. Yep. Although we already had noted that maybe the first trans man to also receive a double mastectomy from another doctor. So between those two things was really pioneering in this. One through Fred, I think we've had a lot with these conversations of historical figures is their interest in medicine. And I am curious how much that stems from an interest in how medicine will then affect you as a human being who is considering your gender identity.
Interesting. I do wonder about that. I do have to say, Andre, my partner, is not super interested in medicine.
Right.
Despite having been raised by two nurses and reading a midwifery type textbook when they were 12.
Maybe being raised by two nurses is the reason they're not interested in it.
That is very true.
I'm not saying that all trans people are interested in medicine, but particularly at this time, if you were wealthy and well-educated and trans, I think that there is a huge amount of opportunity there.
To be fair, medicine was one of the only, respectable careers, though, as well.
That is another good through Fred. Then, this is another similar story to our past historical figure that we talked about. When Michael Dillon's brother died in 1946, Michael inherited the title of the Baronet of Lismullen. But here's the problem.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Michael was working as a mechanic at the time, and the British press was looking for who was going to inherit this title and ended up outing Michael, causing him to lose his job. Went all over British media that this person was not the sex assigned at birth that they were. And it became a huge public issue. So they ended up leaving that career, moving on in the world, and they became a ship's doctor, which is cool.
Went from mechanic to a doctor on a boat. I love it.
Oxford in between those things, so that may be the pathway to those things. But so in addition to...
That's what I need to do. I need to go from doctor on a moving vehicle to social worker. My transition.
Yes,
here.
You're on your way there. In addition to a medical career, Dylan was a prolific writer, which again I thought was very fitting for our guest who we're going to introduce in a little bit here. He authored a book that was titled Self, A Study of Ethics and Endocrinology in 1946, where he detailed his experiences and thoughts about gender without talking about he was not an autobiography. He was specifically writing it very neutral without giving a first-person perspective per se, so that it would be better recognized by the medical community and not just this one trans guy's experience, which I think was really important.
That's really cool and very important.
Now, this part is really divergent. So later in Dylan's life, he decided to go on a quest for spiritual enlightenment. So he moved to India, where he became a Buddhist monk and was the first Westerner to be ordained as a novice Tibetan monk in that tradition.
Wow. All right.
Isn't that interesting? In 1962, he passed away at the age of 47. He did an awful lot in 47 years and left an interesting legacy, of course, a really important one. After his death, there was a manuscript that was found of an autobiography, and his brother was about to burn it, but it was rescued by a historian, saved by Dylan's literary agent at the time in the 60s, and then not until 2016 published under the name Out of the Ordinary.
Wow.
Isn't that incredible?
Wow.
What a cool life.
Yeah. Wow. That is a story. Holy shit. Wow. And like the 1940s, like that is not that long ago, but is long ago. Like that. Wow.
Considering how different all of these things were and how pioneering all of the surgery in particular was, Michael Dillon's story is extremely important to trans history.
Wow. Just wow. Thank you, Michael. Hi, I'm Anna, a transgender person.
And I'm Cam, your dad.
And this is The Transgenda, a podcast chronicling my transition.
And a cisgender man learning how to support it. We're really excited today. We're joined by Jamison Green, who in our conversation before the episode I called a historical figure, which is not something somebody wants to be told before they are no longer a figure in the world. But Jamison, we're so excited to have you. You really are such a huge part of the trans movement, and we're excited to hear from you today.
Thanks so much, Cam, and Anna, too. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's incredible to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I should say, always like to start off guest episodes with the same question, which is, tell us everything about yourself. It's just a small question.
I think your time span is too short.
That's all right. Hit the highlights reel for us.
Let's see. I was born in 1948 in Oakland, California. I was adopted by a really nice couple of people whose last name was Green, and they gave me a very nice, beautiful, feminine name, and I knew from a very young age that was not my name. And I struggled and struggled with trying to figure out where I fit in this world, even from kindergarten. The girl, even though I was forced to wear dresses all the time, I had to wear dresses to school in those days, in the 50s. The girls and the boys both knew that I was not a girl. And it was a very interesting childhood. And fortunately, I had pretty good social skills and a good sense of humor. And I was able to negotiate generally the crazinesses of childhood. And even though I endured some bullying also, I tried to just let it roll off my back as much as possible and would often tell myself, they'll be sorry, because I'm going to do something, good someday. And
you did.
Yeah, I was like,
and
you will?
I hope so. I hope I'm not done yet.
Last episode, we had a young trans woman here in Minnesota on who has become a really outspoken activist for trans rights. And two things that we talked about that you just mentioned that I think are super important. One is kids recognizing gender identity when they're young and really knowing these things before they're indoctrinated into our really often largely misogynistic society and in gender. And then the other piece is the bullying. And that's not changed in the number of years
No,
since you were at that
unfortunately,
age.
it really hasn't.
I will say it is from the bottom of my heart impressive that you were known not to be a girl in the 1940s, 1950s. That is right before the civil rights movements even really got off to a good start. So that's incredible.
Yeah, I wanted to be a writer since I was about 7 years old. Because I loved reading, I loved books, and I also knew at the time that writers, you never saw them. You never knew what sex they were, especially if they used initials in their name, or like George Eliot, who was a female-bodied person who often dressed in men's clothing and wrote under the name of George Eliot. It's just, this stuff is as old as the hills. People have always felt this way. It's not a lot of us. It's not everybody, by all means. And I've always said there's nothing wrong with celebrating your own gender. And just because your gender doesn't match the people's next to you gender shouldn't matter. Your gender is your gender. And some of us don't have one that lines up with our sex. That's all there is to it.
Some of us don't have one.
Some of us don't have one. That's fine too. Just let it go. Why are you worried about other people's gender? Just mind your own gender business.
So you knew from an early age who you were as your gender identity and that you wanted to be a writer. So where did you take it from there?
I was the first girl in my junior high school to take woodshop. I was the first girl to climb the ropes in the boys' gym in junior high. And I did very poorly in school, really. I wasn't really engaged in a lot of school, except anything where I got to write. And so I did well in my English classes, as long as I could write what I wanted to write. And I got into journalism. We had a really good journalism program in my high school. Basically, that was the only class that I did extremely well in. And so I thought, I still want to be a writer. I guess I could major in journalism. And I applied to a bunch of colleges and I got accepted at the University of Oregon. And my grades and everything were so bad. I actually scored very high on the SAT scores in language skills, but very low in math. In fact, my math score was 369. And
I can relate.
Good. They said, you have to major in journalism. So, okay, I said, fine, I'll major in journalism. Took me 2 weeks of being on campus to realize that they had a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing, and I wanted that. That was my goal. And so I majored in journalism for 2 weeks, changed my major to English Lit, and nobody noticed, and off I went. I was also in a number of rock and roll bands. I fronted rock and roll bands, and I also had a jug band.
You had a jug band?
I had a jug band.
What did you play in the jug band?
I played guitar and sang lead a lot, but we had a washtub bass. We had a guy who played jug and somebody who played a washboard. And she was this gorgeous woman who I met in the dorms. And her roommate, they had been friends in high school, the two of them. Her roommate played harmonica, like wild, crazy harmonica. And the one who played the washboard was terrified of being in front of an audience. So she always had her back to the audience when she would play. And she was utterly gorgeous woman. And she huddled up around her washboard and played the washboard while the rest of us were bouncing all around the stage. And eventually, every once in a while, she'd turn around with a big smile on her face and people would cheer. It was great fun. I also did musical comedy and theater. And I flunked out of school. I was of all my friends that I met in my freshman year, I was the only one to flunk out. I was the only one to graduate on time. And I was the only one to go immediately on to grad school.
Wow. That is a journey, I must say. It sounds actually very similar to my journey.
So tell us about this. You flunked out, and yet we're still able to graduate on time.
I flunked out.
I flunked out because
I was playing in 3 bands, and the only class I did really well in was English Comp, and I did okay in an English Lit class, and I did really badly in, I forget what it was, something in my freshman year. I didn't do well in some class. So I got a notice that I was on academic probation. And then I went at the end of the spring term. And then I went off for summer and went backpacking and traveling all around and doing stuff and having a good time. And when I came back in the fall, I forgot that I was on academic probation. And I signed up for a ton of classes, and I flunked Shakespeare. My instructor was a globally renowned Shakespearean scholar, and I flunked. And I was too young. I was too immature. I started college at 17. I was immature, and I wanted to be playing rock and roll and just be writing short stories. It was just bad in that way. But I also got a D in astronomy, which was a 4-unit class as opposed to a 3-unit class like most of the others. So it was really hard to recover from that D as well as the F. So combined, when I went home at Christmas, I got a notice with my report card that said, you've been dismissed. So I didn't tell my parents.
Oh.
I went back to school and I signed up for extension classes. They didn't offer much in extension classes, so that would count on my transcript after I've reapplied. So I had to take Shakespeare I took it in the winter quarter and the spring quarter and summer. And at one point, it suddenly dawned on me what they were trying to get me to do in this Shakespeare class, how I was supposed to be reading these plays. And I wrote this paper, and my teacher accused me of plagiarism. And I said,
Wow.
Oh, no.
And I said, let me show you my writing. And I gave her a bunch of essays that I'd done in English Comp and short stories that I'd written and things like that. And she recognized that I actually could write and that I was actually intelligent. And so she relented and withdrew the plagiarism thing. And I said, you should be thanking yourself. You basically made it possible for me to see what I was doing wrong, what I was missing, what I didn't understand. Don't tell me I'm bad and wrong because you did me a favor. You helped me understand Shakespeare. But I had to stand up for myself for that. And that was not easy. But I was offended that I would be accused of plagiarism when writing was so important to me.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
Jamison, I just have to say, have you listened to our podcast before? Because you're hitting every mark that we always are like, I'm like zoned in. I'm like writing down questions. Like, what do I want to dig into a little bit more?
I did listen to one episode, yes.
The question that's been lingering in my mind is, you took woodshop. Have you continued your woodworking skills?
Not as a hobby or anything. I'm not stupid about drilling holes and cutting things and sanding. I can do all that.
I love that. I was like, that's excellent because I love woodworking, and so it was like in my brain.
Yeah, wood is fantastic and it smells lovely.
It does. It smells so lovely.
So you built this firm foundation as a writer, obviously graduated,
I did.
Found your path to get yourself there. And what was your career path that was built off of that?
After that, I did a bunch of temporary jobs, and then I ended up being the first woman construction cable splicer for the telephone company.
The telephone company, you were a cable splicer, not splicer.
Splicer.
Okay. What is a cable splicer?
But if you look on a telephone pole and you see the cables up there, and you know which ones are power, they're the highest ones. The ones that are lower are telephone cable. And there's this wire strand that holds the cable up. The cable is lashed to that. And inside that cable are a bunch of wires. And those wires have to be connected. Because from your phone, this is going back to landlines before the internet, your phone in your house, there's a wire. It goes outside. It goes up the pole. It runs for miles. And then it goes down the pole. It might go in some manholes. It might go all over the place. And it goes to a central office where there's a switch. When you dial your phone, the signal gets sent along that wire and goes through the switch and ultimately finds the telephone on the other end. It has that number.
Interesting.
And so those wires are miles and miles long, and they have to be connected. Because you can't have a piece of cable that long, because there's all these obstacles in the way. So you have to juggle it around.
You keep saying that you were the first woman to do this, you were the first woman to do that. I'm curious.
That's what people thought I was.
When did you start your social transition?
Technically, in many respects, I started it when I was in kindergarten. I walked in. My parents had me. I was all dressed up. My parents took me to the door. And this grandmotherly sort of woman welcomed me to the classroom, and she goes, over here, the girls are playing over here, and over here there's a couple of boys with the trucks, and you just make yourself at home. And I just walked right over to the boys with the trucks, and sat down and said, here I am, let's play with your trucks.
I love that. So obviously you were straddling the line of both identities then, because it sounds like you were thinking of yourself as the first woman to do
That's
these
what people
things,
told me.
but also,
Yeah.
right, knowing in your heart that wasn't really who you were.
Right, and I often sometimes felt bad about the cable splicer business because my body, it had a very unusually high amount of upper body strength. I was not a typical girl. I could do things that typical girls did not do. I used to give tree climbing lessons in my neighborhood when I was a kid. I charged girls money to teach them how to climb trees.
That sounds like a racket.
It does
Jamison.
also sound like something my partner would do. Absolutely.
Yes, 100%.
I also ran a restaurant in my father's tool shed, and I made all the kids in the neighborhood come and have breakfast there. I made my mother buy all the supplies, and then I never reimbursed her. So it was a really good enterprise for me.
At least you learned how to cook.
I didn't learn how. I boiled water for hot dogs, yeah. And then I poured milk on the cereal. So that was all we did.
Oh my gosh. That's excellent.
I love it.
I think that we have another question here, but before we get to that, I want to ask, you have an excellent beard, a deep and fantastic voice. When did you start taking hormones?
I started taking hormones at age 39 and 11 months.
Wow.
And when I was in the 4th grade, boys wanted to trade voices with me.
Really?
Oh.
That must have felt really
It
good.
did. And then at the same time, though, I also went through something that was very bizarre. Somehow, they decided that I needed to go to speech therapy to learn to modulate my voice like a girl. And so they sent me to speech therapy. I had to leave my regular class and go to a special classroom. I think it was once a week for quite a while. And there were kids in there with real serious speech impediments, real problems. I personally loved reading out loud. I was happy to speak in class. I didn't have speech problems. It was really all about gender. And the girls had to read flowery poetry, and the boys got to read Casey at the Bat. And I'm like, I want to read Casey at the Bat. But no, I had to read these doily things, poems about doilies and stuff. It was just bizarre. And so finally they realized that it wasn't working, and they made my mother come and talk to the school nurse, and the nurse told her to take me to a throat specialist. My mother did. She didn't know. We went to this throat specialist. It was like a dentist's office, except instead of in those days, they had this bowl with water swirling around, and water would spray in this bowl, and he would spit in that bowl. Instead of that bowl with water, it was an eternal flame, and the guy would heat the mirror that the dentist sticks in your mouth and looks at your teeth. This guy had that kind of a mirror. He heated it in that flame and stuck it in my throat to look at my vocal cords. And he would hold onto my tongue with a paper towel and pull on it so that it wouldn't go block. And I told him at one point, I said, I'm 9 years old, right? You're hurting my tongue. I'll hold it for you. You need to let go. I will hold it. And so he...
Oh my God. As an EMT and a person who has intubated like mannequins before, this is the worst technique I have ever heard of for looking at vocal cords.
So
that sounds like pseudoscience.
So he told my mother that I had nodules on my vocal cords and they could surgically remove them. I would have to not speak at all for like at least 3 months. And then after that, there was a possibility that my voice would become a soprano, and then people would reflect back to me that I was a girl.
Wow.
My mother said,
how'd you feel about that?
No, thank you. No surgery. And we left.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Wow.
Yeah. But the message to me was, oh, they want me to think I'm a girl. That's stupid.
Yeah.
Because I'm not like these other girls.
I find it so funny how trans people, especially when they like are young, have so many features that align with their gender as opposed to their sex assigned at birth. Like, I just think about me and my whole deal. And I'm like, looking back and I'm like, oh, I've always had an extraordinary vocal range. Like, I was able to sing down to bass and could get up to a high alto, low soprano, and vocal training just took that to the highest extreme. So, wow.
Yeah.
And that, Anna's voice comes with some other kinds of vocal training that she's received. Did you have to retrain your voice after some of those traumatic sort of
That guy didn't.
people in your life?
Throat doctor didn't do any damage, really. But
Thank
no,
goodness.
I sang a lot and did a lot until when I transitioned, my partner left me. She encouraged me at first, and then she decided no, she didn't want to be with a man. So she just left me, and she was an extremely talented musician, singer, composer, and we did a lot of performing together. That's how we met. That was a constant in our life, in our relationship. Music was everywhere in our house. And not only did she take my 2 children away, but she took music away from me. I could not sing, and it wasn't that my voice was not a problem. Yes, I would have had to retrain if I wanted to continue singing at the same level that I was, but I couldn't retrain at that time because I was so heartbroken. I could not produce song. I could not produce song from my body, from inside my heart, my lungs, my diaphragm. It wouldn't come. It was painful.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And every time I listened to music, I would cry. I just cry. Didn't matter what the song was, I would just cry.
You're talking to 2 very musically minded people. I can't speak for Cam necessarily, but I can definitely, music really it needs to come from all of you. It can't just be like a retraining of your voice or something. No, it has to come from you.
Yeah, it's an art. It's expression. If you've been hurt and wounded, it's very hard to produce that joy and that kind of power, that emotional power. It's very hard. And my daughter...
That's a powerful story.
Thank you. My daughter, she's 38 now. She was 4 when I started my transition. And I've always had contact with my daughter. I did not have contact with my son from the time he was 2 until the time he was 12. And then from the time he was 12 until the time he was 18, I only saw him 6 times. But my daughter has always been a big fan of mine. She made tapes for us to listen to in the car and encouraged me to sing along with rock and roll songs that I liked. And one of my favorite stories is that we're doing Elton John, and I'm just belting it out in the car. We're belting it out, and it's what is that? I can't remember the name of the song. This is a bad problem when you get to be my age. You can't remember nouns, like names of things. So there's a big Elton John song that goes, "I bet she never had a bath in a year." Boom.
Uh-huh.
So my daughter says, "Dad, what's a bat shave?"
Yeah, Elton can be a little hard to parse sometimes.
Yeah,
Nothing like Bob Dylan, but a little challenging.
Oh,
Wow. I love that. That is incredible. And I'm so glad that you were able to re-find that voice, that musical spark.
Yeah.
We, of course, want to hear from you and all about your life because you are an incredible human who's done a lot of cool things. But one of those cool things is your book. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Books up. Yeah, that's true. Multiple books,
right?
But the one that is the most famous one is Becoming a Visible Man. And it was first published in 2004 by Vanderbilt University Press. And it took about 10 years to write that book. But I started with some essays that I had written in the mid-90s. And then as I conceived it into a book, then a lot of rewriting occurred and created this book that actually has continuity in it, not a bunch of isolated essays. But in 2019, they called me up and said, "We've had a lot of turnover here at the press, and we just have been going through a lot of our records and things, and we realized your book is our best-selling book of all time."
What?
And of course, I went with the University Press
phenomenal.
because I knew my book would be a sleeper. There are not enough people are interested in this topic, especially back in 2003, 2002, when I got the contract from them. in 2003 when I turned the manuscript in. But university presses keep their books in print for a long time. They don't expect gigantic sales like a commercial publisher does. And because a commercial publisher, if you don't produce those sales, they take your book out of print. And that's it. And a lot of really good work has been lost because of that. So anyway, yeah. So they asked me if I would. They wanted.
Yeah, go ahead.
2020 was going to be their 80th anniversary year. They wanted to give the book a new treatment, give it a new cover. They asked if I would be willing to write a preface for the second edition. And I said, I'll do you better than that. I'll update the entire text if you'll let me, because a lot has happened since 2003.
That's amazing.
In that manuscript. So I did that. I got it turned into them in 2020, and it published pretty shortly thereafter. And then they sprung for the audiobook version, which I got to read.
Oh,
and that came out.
Oh my gosh. Okay,
great.
That is the copy I'll be picking up
that's
as an
on Audible,
because
and
I
want
to.
Came out in September of 2022.
Wow. Everybody go listen to that audiobook. Go and support Jamison.
Are people who
it's incredible.
Read this book every year like a ritual. They read it over and over, and they tell me that every time they learn something new, and that more ideas come to them. They learn more about themselves from this book. And I've had cisgender men tell me, especially gay men, they go, I thought I pretty much understood masculinity. I'm a gay man, after all. I'm all about masculinity. He said, but I learned so much from reading this book. I had no idea. So I'm pretty proud of it.
One of the premises of the book, Jamison, that really got me excited to have you on is you truly were opening a door to a conversation that is still being lost, which is trans masc people and trans men in the world. And we have learned that in our podcast. And we had Aidan Dowling on, which was such a good person to be promoting trans masculinity. But it does get missed a lot. And so I would just love for you to expand. What have you heard back from people about that missing component of the trans conversation?
I'm working with right now an intergenerational group of trans men who are interested in exploring and understanding and being more intentional about masculinity. And one small group of them have started a new 501c3 called the Intentional Man Project. And Rocco Chiatos, who organized that project, also started Camp Lost Boys, which I attend, and I usually give a big fireside chat all about trans masculine history. And a lot of people I overheard one guy say, that talk was worth the whole cost of camp.
Yes.
I've also heard people say that the first chapter in my book is worth the price of the whole book, that sort of thing. And people say that they just get a lot out of what I have to say and what I know and what I love to share. I'm not the kind of person who promotes himself. I'm not good at self-promotion. People think I have a big ego and I'm really self-centered, but I'm really very shy. And I don't talk about myself very much. And you're encouraging me to do that here, so that's
I
why
love
I'm
it.
doing it.
You do not come off that way to me, at least in the slightest.
And
so as egotistical at all. You seem very self-reflective.
I think that is just a thing that anybody who has any experience in the public light for some reason or another gets that tag. Because I have also been called that, and I am like,
yeah,
really? People just, yeah.
Yeah. I've also seen reviews posted about my book by young trans men saying, I don't need some old trans guy telling me how to be a man. No, this guy doesn't know anything about my life and what I have to deal with every day. Sure. Okay. Yeah, you can think that. Go ahead.
Maybe that's a good segue to something that came to mind here. And we had our friend Sean Hayes on, who is a trans man who's really influential in our community and a big supporter of our podcast, but also just a good mentor for us. And one thing that he talked about when he was on was leaning really far into toxic masculinity because that's what he felt like the man was supposed to be. How did you feel like that plays in trans masculinity? Because I hear that in exactly what you're saying, those reviews of, I know how to be a man, nobody can teach me anything. What does that mean to you?
I think there's resistance on the pro-toxic masculinity side as well as on the anti-toxic masculinity side. People make assumptions about anybody who's going to talk about masculinity from whichever direction they're coming from. And because masculinity gets such a bad rap in our culture. And it doesn't surprise me, unfortunately, that there are some, and I see this in any age group, depending on when you start transition. You can start transition at 40 or 50 or even 60, and you can still go into one of those toxic masculinity phases. On one hand, I think it happens more often with people who don't think much about masculinity or femininity before they actually transition.
That is fair. One thing that we have a lot of eggs. I don't know if you have encountered that term, but a lot of like trans people who are new to their transition or are new to the concepts and everything. Gender questioning
and not quite there to the transition part of the whole experience.
And a lot of them are much older than even I am. Not that I'm old by any means, but I expect when I hear the term like egg or questioning trans person or something, I expect like 12-year-olds when I started to really start to come out and question. And it sounds like you really started to transition early in life when you were in kindergarten, but also really start to come out and transition later in life. Is there any part of that toxic masculinity that you learned to not fall into because you were an older trans person?
When I was being a cable splicer, it was a big challenge for a lot of the men around me. They'd never had a woman on the crew. I was the girl. And people would come up, when you first start splicing, you're an apprentice and you work with another guy for 6 months before you get your own truck. You have to prove yourself before you can get your own truck. And guys would come up to me and the guy I'm working with. They would be driving by and they'd stop and they'd come up to the window. We're sitting at the side of the road having our lunch or something. And they'd come up to the window of the other guy and they'd talk to him as if I wasn't there. And they'd say, "So what's it like working with a broad? You have to do everything for her? I bet you have to carry everything." She doesn't carry anything, does she? And then they'd say to me, "You're taking food out of the mouth of some child because some guy didn't get a job because you got this job.
Jesus.
What makes you think I'm not feeding a child at home?" And then they'd shut up.
Right.
And then they didn't know what to say. So I didn't fight anything. I listened. I didn't push anything.
Yeah.
I listened. And I read the room constantly. And I tried to figure out what is it that's going to connect with these guys. And at one point, I'm having lunch with a bunch of guys, and somebody says, "No, they shouldn't let women be cable splicers." But I said, "Do you know who you're talking to here?" And they said, "Oh, you're different. You're different." I was different.
You were different,
I was different. And
That's
I
what they
worried
needed.
about that because once I broke the barrier, because they were under consent decree to hire women and minorities in non-traditional jobs. And I broke the barrier for women in that particular job. And because they'd already broken it for women installation crew people, installers, because that's a much less physically demanding job. But yeah, after I broke that barrier, they lowered the requirements. They figured, I guess we're not going to beat this consent decree, so we better get some more women on here. So they lowered the requirements, and women were getting hurt on the job because they weren't qualified. And I knew that I had physical capabilities that the average woman didn't have. And I'm short, but I'm incredibly strong. And I was on my high school and college ski team. I backpacked every summer. I did rock climbing. I did all this stuff that most girls in those days never did. And in fact, I had to do this one class in PE, girls PE. They made you go through this circuit of exercises and they rated you. And then at the end of the quarter, after all this conditioning stuff, you do it again and they'd show you how much you improved. And I had to hang on this bar, this parallel bar. You'd hang there. They'd take the stool away from you, out from under your feet, and they time you to see how long you could hold yourself up. I'm holding, and I'm holding, and I'm holding. And they start screaming at me, "Come down." And I'm like, "Why? You said to hang here as long as I could." They said, "You're going to mess up our curve."
Oh.
I also got myself an exemption from PE because I hated girls' PE. I hated it. It was not where I needed to be or wanted to be. was horrible. And they were always trying to get me to be on some team. And I'm like, no, I'm not going near your locker room.
Yeah.
It's not your thing. Knowing that we have about 15 or so minutes here left, I want to take a really hard pivot because there's one more thing I really wanted you to share with us. So I became aware of you because I sat in a really cool session talking about the Research Institute of Gender Therapeutics that's doing some really cool work. You serve on their Citizens Advisory Board, partially because you have been really instrumental in pioneering in health insurance for gender-affirming healthcare. So can you talk to us a little bit about RIGHT and like the work that you've done around this really important issue for trans folks?
The Research Institute for Gender Therapeutics is a very new organization, and it's just getting off the ground. But we have a scientific advisory board that has a lot of trans people on it, but the president of the organization is a man who's done research therapeutics for a long time. He's very concerned that the fact that we don't have an FDA-approved hormone therapy, and he wants to make that happen. Because I've talked to people from pharmaceutical companies many times over the years who are supportive of trans people. And I know that, for instance, with testosterone, it's almost all manufactured outside the United States. And every once in a while, there are terrible supply problems, and you can't get any. And it's also I forget what it is, schedule something controlled substance.
It's a Schedule 1 drug.
Yeah, and it's a controlled substance. So it has to be dealt with in specific ways. And that makes it really difficult sometimes. Nobody, in all the years that I've talked with people about it, they all say nobody's going to spring for FDA approval because it just costs too much. And there's not a big enough market.
Oh, that pisses me off. There's definitely oh.
But if you're just chasing the dollars, there are other things they'd rather put their money into approving.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, here's an opportunity. This guy's had a lot of experience doing this with different preparations and going through that regulatory process. He knows the ropes, and he's willing to put it together. So he's working on an estrogen preparation as well as a testosterone preparation.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
I
thought,
yeah,
there's no reason not to check it out, especially if it's going to go through testing. It's not like we're making up something and we're just going to turn around and put it on the internet. It's going to be tested.
That is really incredible, and I am so excited to see the work that you do, especially for testosterone, being that it is a much harder substance to get than estrogen, even though estrogen is also very challenging to get, especially for your transgender therapy. You know, in the last couple minutes here, what advice do you have for trans folks? And I think that can be any trans folks, trans masc folks, older trans folks, whatever.
Advice. Right now, we are under attack. And we've never seen it like this before because it's so loud. But we have been under attack like this before. It's just never been this loud. And I think that we can overcome this. And I want to encourage people to just hold on, live your life, have your best life, do the best you can, and don't buy into the crap that they're dishing out, because that's what it is. And people are fighting for you. People are fighting for all of us right now, including myself in whatever way I can. But many people and many allies, and we have more allies now than we have ever had before. And people are not going to back down. Some people are afraid. Some people are going to be timid. But on the whole, we're not going to give in. And they can't erase us. They may try to legislate us out of existence, but they can't stop us from being born.
It's very true and very, very. I think that's where I'm going to just end that sentence.
It's just very, it's very.
Sorry this wasn't as funny as...
We had those moments of humor in there. That was great.
Sorry, it's also important to recognize, and that's something that we always do as well, is recognize that, it's fucked up where we're at in our country right now, and it's fucked up where we're at in the world right now. And so I think it's important to hear that, too, from someone who isn't two funny people on the internet, someone who has really entrenched himself in this work.
So we know we can find your book through Vanderbilt Press, and we can get your audiobook on Audible.
From any bookstore. They can order it for you if they don't have it in stock.
Heck yeah.
Where else would you like people to know to find you in the world?
I have a sort of author website that only has this book on it right now. I have other things to put on it, but I don't have time to put them on yet. But it's jamisongreen.com. And I also have an Instagram account, but I don't know how to use it.
That's very fair.
So I haven't figured that out yet. My daughter is really good at Instagram. So she's hard to get an appointment with. But I'm going to sit down. She's already agreed. She will sit down and teach me how to use my Instagram account at some point.
You should talk to Cam about having a daughter who's hard to schedule an appointment with.
I have that. Yep.
I can relate. Yeah. And I can relate to honest difficulties too. But I don't have time for much. My wife is always, stop looking at your computer.
Yes.
Stop answering emails. Don't answer that phone call.
Yes. You know, the way that I always like to end these episodes, and I can't ever remember how it actually started. I think it was just something that I was like, I want to do this. But we always end our episodes with the gender euphoria. Jamison, do you have a gender euphoria for us today?
What is a gender euphoria? I'm just me.
It is what makes you feel good about your gender, about your masculinity, about your transness, whatever. Or it could be something like, I got this cool new shirt and it makes me feel really good about myself. It's really anything that makes you feel just good.
I just feel fabulous in this body. It's just me. And I just love being alive in this body.
You're being euphoric in who you are, and that is incredible. I think that's an achievement.
Yeah, thank you.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Jamison. This has been an incredible interview, and I am so excited for us to read your book as well as for our listeners to go and read your book. Please, listeners, this is not a book that you want to skip out on.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. And more is coming. More is coming.
It was so much fun talking with Jamison today. I'm ecstatic about it. And you all should definitely go check out his book. But before you do that, we have a shout out this week from Delta, the person, not the airline. Don't think that Delta wants to come onto our podcast based on their previous human rights violations.
And so this is our very first shout out. Thank you so much, Delta, for being the testing ground for this. And this is what Delta sent us. Misfit Media is a podcast about queerness, disability, fatness, and more, with a focus on personal experience, knowledge, and intra-community topics. Tune in every Sunday for bite-sized episodes in which the host, Delta, talks about all sorts of things, ranging from being non-binary, neurodivergence, or living in a fat body. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Again, thank you so much, Delta. Amazing. And if you want your own shout-out, you can buy one by visiting transgenderpod.com and clicking on Shoutout. Thank you, Delta, again, for supporting the show.
You can also support the show by becoming a patron on our Patreon.
Like Rosie Wozy. Thank you so much for your support, Rosie Wozy. Just incredible, all the support that you guys give us.
If you have questions about transitioning or supporting someone who is transitioning and you'd like us to talk about it on the show, please shoot an email to questions@transgendapod.com, click on the chat with us button on the website, or DM us on social media.
The website, the one website, you know what it is.
Somewhere on the web you will find us. Just shout into the void.
Or buy a shout out. Be sure to check out our episode description for links to resources on today's topics, especially Jamison's book, the one that we talked about, but also the rest of his incredible books.
We'll link them.
They'll be in the description.
And thanks for listening. I've been Cam.
I've been Anna.
And this has been The Transgender.
A very weird episode of The Transgender.
What isn't?
Love you all, except the bigots.